The Horny Race. Chapter 1. The galaxy was vast, but one thing was certain. Whenever a Terranian entered a bar, everyone stopped and stared. It didn't matter the planet, the quadrant, or how many arms the locals had. Terranians had a reputation. Some looked at them with awe, others with envy, and a good chunk with pure, unfiltered hatred. Why? Simple. Terranians were the horniest race in the universe. It wasn't by choice, of course. Centuries ago, a Terranian scientist named Dr. Humph put the final touches on a serum designed to increase their species' reproduction rates. Unfortunately, Humph wasn't exactly clear on the dosing. The result, a perpetual state of, well, interest in anything that moved, or didn't move for that matter. As far as anyone was concerned, Terranians were essentially walking pheromone bombs. Enter Zorvok's Cantina, the most popular watering hole on the planet, Blarg 9. The crowd was a mix of species: Dractharians with their 3 heads, the smooth-skinned glebes, and the ever-mysterious Zippotites who spoke only in beeps. Everyone was minding their own business, nursing drinks that bubbled, hissed, or occasionally tried to escape. That was until the door swung open and a Terranian strutted in. His name was Steve. He had a cocky grin, messy hair, and the kind of swagger that said, "Yeah, I'm here. Deal with it." Immediately, the bar went silent. All eyes turned towards Steve. The Dractharians hissed in disgust. One of the glebes glared, her translucent skin pulsing a deep, irritated purple. Even the Zippotites beeped angrily, though it was hard to tell whether they were mad at Steve or just communicating the latest sports scores. Steve sauntered up to the bar and flashed a smile at the bartender, a grizzled old nerf who had seen too many bar fights and too many Terranians. "Get me a slagnog," Steve said, his voice oozing with confidence. The bartender raised a brow, which was impressive since nerfs didn't have eyebrows. "You sure?" Last Terranian who ordered a slagnog. "Well, let's just say it got messy." Steve chuckled. "Messy's my middle name." At the other end of the bar, a tall, scaly being known as a Gork looked Steve up and down. "Terranian, huh?" he sneered. "I've heard about your kind. Always causing trouble wherever you go, stirring things up." Steve shrugged nonchalantly. "Hey, can I help it if we're irresistible?" Gork growled, his scales rattling. "Irresistible? More like insufferable. You walk in here with your smug grin, thinking you're better than everyone. You're nothing but a walking hormone." The bar murmured in agreement. The glebe nodded furiously, her skin turning a deep shade of red. "It's not fair," she muttered. "The pheromones. They mess with our emotions." Steve leaned against the bar, sipping his drink. "Look, I get it. I really do. But it's not easy being a Terranian, you know. Everywhere I go, people either hate me, want to fight me, or want to." The Gork slammed his fist on the table. "We know exactly what they want to do, Terranian." Suddenly, the door to the bar swung open again, and in walked another Terranian. This time, a woman named Jessica. The crowd gasped audibly. "Oh no, not 2 of them," someone whispered. Jessica surveyed the room, her eyes narrowing as she spotted Steve. "You again?" she groaned. "What is it with you and showing up at the worst possible times?" Steve grinned. "Well, Jess, you know how it is. Can't keep a good Terranian down." Jessica rolled her eyes and took a seat at the bar, immediately surrounded by a group of curious onlookers. "You think this is some kind of game, Steve? You're giving us a bad name." Steve chuckled, taking another swig of his slagnog. "Bad name? Nah. I'm just living the dream." The bartender, shaking his head, muttered under his breath. "Not every damn time." But before anyone could respond, a strange sound filled the air. A high-pitched whine, like the universe itself was annoyed. Suddenly, the door burst open, and in walked a Veltoxian, a gelatinous, blob-like creature that was notorious for its ability to absorb anything in its path. The Veltoxian wobbled toward the bar, its eyes fixated on Steve. "You," it gurgled. "You're the reason my people are in turmoil." Steve blinked. "Me? Yes." The Veltoxian oozed, getting closer. "Your species, your pheromones, they drive us mad. We Veltoxians are a peaceful race, but whenever a Terranian shows up, we lose control. Steve raised an eyebrow. Wait, are you saying the Veltoxian quivered? I'm saying we've fallen in love. The entire bar went silent again. Even the Gorg, who had been ready to pummel Steve a moment ago, paused. Steve glanced at Jessica, who simply sighed. Great. Another one. The Veltoxian extended a slimy tendril toward Steve. Come with me, Terranian. Together, we shall rule the stars. Steve took a step back, eyes wide. I'm flattered, really, but I've got this whole thing with being single and free, you know? The Veltoxian quivered in disappointment. But before it could respond, the door to the bar creaked open again. This time, a galactic marshal stepped in, her uniform gleaming and her face stern. All right, she said, hands on her hips. Which one of you Terranians is causing trouble this time? Steve and Jessica both pointed at each other. The marshal sighed. Figures. As she marched them both out of the bar, the patrons slowly returned to their drinks, grateful for the peace and quiet. Well, the bartender muttered to no one in particular. At least they didn't break anything this time. Back on the street, Steve grinned at Jessica. So, what do you think? Drinks tomorrow? Jessica groaned. I hate you, Steve. But deep down, they both knew. No matter how much trouble they caused, the galaxy just couldn't get enough of the horniest race. Meanwhile, deep in the galactic core, the Intergalactic Council convened inside their grand hall, a cavernous chamber carved from the living crystals of the planet Zynek. This was where the most critical decisions in the galaxy were made, from trade disputes to interstellar wars. Today's agenda, however, was a little more unusual. At the head of the table sat Chancellor Thrum, a tentacled being from the planet Ultronix, known for its strict sense of order, and a body that resembled a glowing purple jellyfish in a fancy suit. His tentacles twitched nervously as he reviewed the latest reports. Fellow councillors, Thrum began in a voice that sounded like bubbles popping. We are faced with an unprecedented crisis. The Terranians, they're wreaking havoc across the galaxy. A chorus of anxious murmurs filled the hall. I've received complaints from nearly every sector. Thrum continued, his tentacles shivering with agitation. They're pheromones. It's out of control. Entire planets are being plunged into chaos. Next to him, Councillor Glip, a gelatinous blob from the planet Blorg, squelched in agreement. Yes, Glip blubbered, his many eyes blinking rapidly. I've heard stories, even on Blorg. We blobs have no romantic feelings at all, yet somehow, when a Terranian visited, well, let's just say there's been merging like we've never seen before. Disgraceful, bellowed Councillor Gorzak, a hulking four-armed brute from the warlike planet Gorzakon. My people have never bowed to any outside influence. Yet, when a single Terranian entered our battle coliseum, our greatest warriors were too distracted to even throw a punch. They were too busy asking the Terranian to grab a drink after the match. He slammed one of his fists down on the table, causing the entire chamber to shake. It's humiliating. The council fell into a brief silence, trying to absorb the magnitude of the issue. Chancellor Thrum sighed, rubbing what might have been his forehead if jellyfish had such things. This is becoming a galactic emergency. Councillor Nibglorg, a scaly reptilian from the planet Snarv, hissed as she leaned forward. We should quarantine Earth, block their spaceports, ban them from interstellar travel until we figure out how to neutralize these pheromones. Indeed, Councillor Glip chimed in. We must stop this madness before the entire galaxy falls prey to their charm. At the back of the room, a strange hum echoed through the chamber. A cloaked figure floated toward the table. It was Councillor Zib, a Ziptolian, a species known for their complete lack of emotions and their language of cryptic beeps and clicks. Zib beeped softly, then paused dramatically. The translation drone hanging above Zib whirred to life, speaking in a dull monotone. Zib suggests we invite the Terranians here, analyze their behavior, determine their weakness. There was a murmur of agreement. Chancellor Thrum nodded thoughtfully. Perhaps you're right, Councillor Zib. We need to study the Terranians in person. We will summon representatives to the council immediately, but we must be careful. We cannot let ourselves fall prey to their charms. The council agreed, but each of them felt a tiny flicker of doubt. After all, the stories of Terranian encounters were legendary. Could they, the galaxy's most powerful and disciplined beings, really resist? 1 week later, the Grand Chamber of the Intergalactic Council was abuzz with anticipation. Word had spread throughout the galaxy. The Terranians were coming. Councillors sat stiffly at their designated seats, determined to keep their composure. The doors opened, and in walked Steve and Jessica, Earth's self-proclaimed ambassadors, mostly because they had no one better to send. Steve, as usual, wore his trademark smirk, while Jessica strolled in with an air of practiced indifference. As soon as they entered, the atmosphere in the room shifted. It was subtle at first, just a slight rustling of robes, a few awkward coughs, a nervous glance here and there. But then it hit. The pheromones, invisible waves of Terranian allure, spread through the air like a warm breeze, causing more than one counselor to squirm in their seat. Steve, ever the charmer, flashed a grin at the council. "So, you guys called us here for... what? Another medal? I really don't have room for more on my ship's dashboard." Jessica rolled her eyes. "Or is this about that whole Veltoxian incident? For the record, we didn't ask them to fall in love with us. That's just biology." Chancellor Thrum tried to maintain his composure, though his tentacles were twitching wildly. "Terranians, we summoned you here to address the growing concern of your, influence on galactic affairs." Steve winked at Jessica. "Hear that? They're concerned about our influence. I think we finally made it big." Jessica snorted. "Yeah, we're practically galactic celebrities." Councillor Glip's gelatinous body wobbled as he spoke up, clearly trying to regain control of the meeting. "This isn't a joke. Your pheromones are causing widespread chaos. We demand that you cease your travels until we find a solution." Steve shrugged. "Look, if you guys can figure out a way to turn off the pheromones, go ahead. But until then, we're just doing what we do best, being Terranians." At the far end of the table, Councillor Gorzak, the battle-hardened brute, was beginning to sweat. His 4 muscular arms flexed nervously as he stared at Steve and Jessica. "Your confidence," he muttered, almost to himself. "It's oddly appealing." Jessica raised an eyebrow. "You okay, big guy? You look a little tense." Gorzak gulped, his usually booming voice reduced to a soft rumble. "Perhaps, after this meeting, we could discuss galactic battle tactics over drinks." Chancellor Thrum waved his tentacles frantically, as if trying to clear the air of pheromones. "No, Volcus. We cannot let them sway us." But it was too late. Councillor Glip's eyes had turned a faint shade of pink, an embarrassing color for a blob. "Terranians," he blubbered, sliding closer. "Do you, by any chance, need an advisor? Someone to assist you on your adventures? I'm very flexible. Literally." Steve leaned back in his chair, grinning from ear to ear. "Wow, Jess, looks like we're getting job offers now." Jessica sighed, watching as more counselors began to shift uncomfortably. Zib, the Ziptolian, let out a long, flustered beep. Even Niblorg, who had sworn to resist, was visibly fidgeting with her scaly fingers, her eyes darting towards Steve and Jessica with increasing frequency. Finally, Chancellor Thrum slammed a tentacle down on the table in desperation. This meeting is over. I declare that we will reconvene once we have, sorted out this issue." As the counselors hastily gathered their things and fled the room, Steve and Jessica exchanged a look. "Well," Steve said, grinning, "I'd call that a win." Jessica smirked. "Yeah, but next time, maybe we should charge for appearances. These guys are easy money." And with that, the 2 Terranians strutted out of the council chamber, leaving behind a trail of confused, blushing, and strangely infatuated counselors in their wake. Chapter 2. The Krog Invasion. A love story. The galaxy teetered on the brink of destruction. The Krogs, massive, brutish, and uglier than a planet-wide garbage fire, had begun their assault. Entire star systems fell before their relentless advance. With each conquered planet, they grew bolder, more bloodthirsty, and somehow even uglier. It seemed that nothing could stop them. The Intergalactic Council, usually composed of squabbling diplomats and various blobs in fancy robes, was in a full-blown panic. In the Grand Council Hall, Chancellor Thrum, a jellyfish-like creature whose stress levels were now measurable in light years, floated behind his podium. His tentacles quivered as he addressed the nervous assembly. "We are facing total annihilation. Thrum bubbled, his voice resembling a dozen wet balloons popping at once. The Krogs are unstoppable. Our weapons, diplomacy, even reason have failed. We need a miracle. Or a drink, muttered Councillor Glip, a gelatinous blob who had clearly given up on any hope of survival. I could use one about now. Councillor Gorzak, the council's resident musclehead from Gorzakon, banged 4 meaty fists on the table. We will not surrender. We will fight the Krogs until our last. We've tried that, Thrum interrupted, his tentacles flailing in irritation. It didn't work. Their armor is impenetrable, and their tactics are, frankly, terrifying. The council chamber fell into a gloomy silence. They were out of options, and doom was knocking. That was, until a spark of madness lit in Chancellor Thrum's brain. There is one thing we haven't tried, he said, his voice suddenly cautious. But it's dangerous, it's reckless, it could work. Every councillor leaned in, hopeful yet horrified. What if... Thrum hesitated. What if we use the Terranians? The council erupted into chaos. Terranians? Glip gasped, half melting in shock. We can't control them. I'd rather face the Krogs, Gorzak growled, cracking his knuckles. At least they fight with honor. But Thrum had already made up his mind. We don't have a choice. The Terranians have one weapon more powerful than anything we could muster. Their pheromones. If we deploy them strategically, we might distract the Krog fleet long enough to stop their invasion. Deep in space, Steve lay sprawled out on the deck of the Wanderlust, sipping a fluorescent beverage while gazing out at the swirling nebulae. He had his boots kicked up on the console, a casual grin plastered across his face, and the general demeanor of someone who thought responsibility was a species of fish. Nearby, Jessica was fiddling with some wiring, occasionally glaring at Steve like she was seconds away from strangling him. I'm starting to think laziness is a genetic trait, she muttered. Their banter was interrupted by a loud beeping from the comms. Steve lazily reached out, hitting the answer button with his foot. The holographic form of Chancellor Thrum flickered into view. Terranians. Thrum began, his voice more exasperated than usual. The galaxy needs your unique talents. Steve raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Oh yeah, which talents specifically? The ones that involve saving planets, or the ones that involve annoying the hell out of people? Jessica snorted, as if there's a difference with you. Thrum ignored the comment. The Krogs are invading. They already wiped out half of Sector 9. Our military can't stop them. Our diplomats can't reason with them. But we believe your pheromones might be able to... Steve's eyes lit up. You want us to seduce the Krog fleet? Thrum winced. Not seduced exactly. Just incapacitate. Distract. Use your pheromones to throw them off their game. Jessica crossed her arms, unimpressed. You're seriously asking us to weaponize our natural charm? That's your master plan? Thrum twitched nervously. We've constructed a delivery system, a bomb of sorts, filled with amplified Terranian pheromones. We'll drop it in the center of the Krog fleet, and if all goes according to plan, they'll be too overwhelmed to continue their invasion. Steve chuckled, a gleam in his eye. You want us to blow their minds with love. Now that is something I can get behind. Hours later, Steve and Jessica stood on the bridge of a massive council warship, facing the biggest fleet of Krog ships anyone had ever seen. There were enough jagged, horrifying vessels out there to make even the bravest warrior soil their spacesuit. But Steve, ever the optimist, was grinning like he'd just won the lottery. So, how does this pheromone bomb work exactly? He asked, eyeing the sleek device in the center of the room. A nervous council engineer, who was visibly sweating despite the cold, stepped forward. It's very simple. Once we launch the bomb into the heart of their fleet, it will release an enhanced version of your species' pheromones. They'll spread through the Krog ships, and, well, let's just say they won't be in any condition to fight. Condition? Jessica repeated, eyebrows raised. What? They'll just fall in love with the first thing they see. The engineer swallowed hard. Something like that. Steve rubbed his hands together. Let's do it. As the bomb launched, the entire crew on the warship held their breath. The countdown echoed through the chamber, and Steve was practically vibrating with excitement. This is gonna be legendary. The bomb sped toward the Krog fleet, a shining beacon of pheromonal madness. It detonated with a brilliant, almost romantic flash. For a moment, nothing happened. The Krog ships still loomed like a wall of death. Then the first Krog cruiser wobbled, and then another. Soon, the entire fleet began drifting off course, their once terrifying precision dissolving into chaos. Inside the Krog flagship, Commander Grawl, a fearsome creature with too many fangs to count, felt a strange sensation. His heart, previously reserved for battle and conquest, began to flutter. He glanced at the view screen, where Steve's holographic form had appeared. And for the first time in his life, Commander Grawl knew true beauty. "Is this love?" he muttered to himself, his multiple eyes focusing dreamily on Steve's cocky grin. Nearby, his second-in-command, who had never even felt the slightest hint of affection in his life, gazed longingly at the hologram. "It's magnificent." Across the fleet, Krog warriors dropped their weapons. Battle orders were replaced with love letters. Messages of war turned into poorly written space poetry. One Krog even attempted to serenade his entire crew with a love ballad about Steve's hair. Back on the warship, Steve leaned against the console, grinning. "Well, Jess, looks like we just saved the galaxy without sex appeal." Jessica shook her head in disbelief. "I can't believe that actually worked. I was expecting a laser to the face, not a Krog love fest." Chancellor Thrum's voice crackled over the comms. "Terranians, it's working. The Krogs are falling back. They're too enamored with you to continue their attack." Steve's grin widened. "I guess you could say they've got a crush." Jessica groaned, but couldn't help smirking. "If you make one more terrible pun, I'll personally throw you into a Krog ship." As the Krog fleet slowly retreated, still hopelessly love-struck, the Intergalactic Council convened once again, but this time in celebration. Chancellor Thrum, looking marginally less stressed, stood before the two Terranians, who were basking in their newfound fame. "You've saved us all," Thrum said with a mixture of awe and horror. "Your unique talents have spared the galaxy from certain doom." Steve puffed out his chest. "Just another day at the office." Jessica sighed. "If this becomes a regular thing, I'm going to need a raise." As the counselors applauded, Steve turned to Jessica, his signature grin firmly in place. "So, Jess, drinks later? You know, to celebrate." She shot him a withering look. "Not a chance." And yet, as they strode out of the council chamber, leaving behind a trail of chaos, admiration, and a galaxy full of very confused Krogs, one thing was clear. No one could resist the Terranians, no matter how hard they tried. As the Terranians basked in the glow of their unexpected victory, life across the galaxy began to return to its chaotic, yet more manageable, normalcy. Krog poetry was still circulating on various galactic networks, much to the discomfort of anyone with functioning ears or taste. The council chambers, once filled with dread and despair, now hummed with the sounds of celebration. Back on the Wanderlust, Steve was still riding the high of being the galaxy's accidental heartthrob. "I gotta say, Jess," he said, leaning back in his chair and tossing a grape into his mouth, "saving the universe with my charm and pheromones. Never thought I'd top that." Jessica rolled her eyes as she inspected a particularly stubborn wire under the console. "Yeah, Steve, your charm won a war. Let's build a statue in your honor. Maybe a fountain too, one that plays Krog love ballads." Steve nodded thoughtfully, missing the sarcasm entirely. "That's not a bad idea. They could model it after my best side, although that might be tough, considering both sides are pretty amazing." Jessica sighed and stood up, brushing off her hands. "You do realize that the Krogs will eventually snap out of it, right? One moment they're writing sonnets about your hair, the next, bam, laser beams and bloodthirsty conquest again." Steve shrugged. "Yeah, but we've bought ourselves some time, and I'm sure we'll come up with something else to throw at them. Maybe next time we weaponize our dance moves." Jessica stared at him, deadpan. "Please don't. We can't risk universal collapse just because you think you can moonwalk." Their banter was interrupted by a sudden, high-pitched buzzing from the ship's comms. Steve jabbed the button with his foot. Chancellor Thrum's hologram appeared again, but this time he looked slightly less like a jellyfish in the middle of a nervous breakdown and more like a jellyfish that had just received an unexpectedly good tax refund. "Terranians," Thrum began, with just a hint of reluctance. I Hate to interrupt your victory lap, but we have a bit of a situation. Steve clapped his hands together. I knew it. They need us again. I mean, who else could save the galaxy twice in 1 week? Thrum twitched. No, nothing like that. The Krogs are still distracted. The problem is, we've had side effects. Jessica narrowed her eyes. Side effects? Thrum shifted uncomfortably. Yes, it seems the pheromones have lingered. The Krog fleet isn't the only thing affected. Jessica groaned. What now? Did we accidentally charm the entire council too? Thrum winced. Not the council, no. Worse. He sighed, his tentacles drooping. It's the space llamas. There was a long, confused silence. Steve blinked. The space llamas. Thrum nodded gravely. Yes, the space llamas of Zixon 5 have been overly affectionate since the pheromone cloud passed through their system. It's becoming a problem. Jessica shot Steve a look that could melt metal. This is your fault. Steve held up his hands defensively. Hey, we were saving the galaxy. I didn't know we'd end up with a bunch of love-struck space llamas. Thrum coughed. It's not just the llamas. There are reports coming in from other systems as well. The asteroid belts around Glorb are now hosting what can only be described as an intergalactic singles mingle. And there are complications on planet Zybern, where the sentient mushrooms have started composing ballads. Steve perked up. Mushroom ballads? I've always wanted to hear one of those. Jessica slapped her forehead. This is why we can't have nice things. Thrum continued. I'm afraid we'll need your help once again, Terranians. We're sending you to Zixon 5 to, calm down the space llamas before they become even bigger issue. Steve smirked. You want me to calm down a herd of lovesick llamas? Sounds like a walk in the park. Jessica snorted. More like a walk into a llama stampede. Good luck. Hours later, the Wanderlust landed gently on the grassy plains of Zixon 5, where hundreds of space llamas were prancing around, their fur gleaming under the twin suns. They all seemed disturbingly fixated on Steve, who stood at the ramp with his hands on his hips, grinning like he was on the cover of a romance novel. All right, llamas, Steve called, his voice filled with bravado. Time to chill out. One of the llamas, its eyes disturbingly dreamy, let out a soft, almost cooing sound as it approached. Behind it, the entire herd started moving, their gaze locked on Steve. Steve, Jessica warned, stepping back. I think they're in love with you. Steve beamed. Who could blame them? But don't worry, I've got this. As Steve took a step forward, the llamas began to move faster, their sius turning into frantic bleats. Suddenly, the entire herd was charging toward him, not in anger, but in overwhelming affection. Jessica, now safely hidden behind a boulder, watched as Steve was engulfed in a sea of furry, adoring space llamas. I give him 10 minutes before he begs for help. Steve's muffled voice floated up from the pile of llamas. Jess, a little help here? Jessica leaned back, crossing her arms with a satisfied smirk. Not a chance, Casanova. And so, as Steve wrestled with his unintended army of llama lovers and Jessica enjoyed the rare silence, one thing remained true. In the vast, unpredictable chaos of the galaxy, the Terranians, much like their pheromones, were truly irresistible, and the galaxy, for better or worse, would never be the same again.